Hello, my name is Darcy Duran, and this is Welcome to Cognitive Theory of Multimedia Learning. Cognitive theory of multimedia learning is one of the cognitivist learning theories introduced by an American psychology professor, Richard Mayer, in the 1990s. This theory is a subtheory of John Sweller's cognitive load theory applied especially for multimedia learning, and therefore has many similarities with it. Basic assumption of Mayer's theory is that the human working memory has two subcomponents that work in parallel, the visual and verbal, acoustic, and that learning can be more successful if both of these channels are used for information processing at the same time. Mayer's theory is based on three assumptions. 1. Dual channel assumption. 2. Limited capacity assumption. 3. Active processing assumption. Dual channel assumption. The verbal and visual channels, similar to what Bradley called phonological loop system and visuospatial sketchpad in our working memory, are separated and can be used for processing information simultaneously, thus enhancing process of learning. Limited capacity assumption. As Miller's information processing theory has shown, these channels have limited capacity and limited time they can hold information. Too much information can therefore cause cognitive overload. Active processing assumption. Learning is an active process of collecting, organizing, and integrating new information. Similarities with constructivist learning may be noticed in this definition. Here is an example of the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. There's the multimedia presentation, sensory memory, working memory, and the long-term memory. As mentioned, research in frames of cognitive theory of multimedia learning and cognitive load theory has revealed a number of principles and effects introduced by Sweller, Mayer, and a number of other researchers. Simplified, these principles and effects suggest that students learn better from words and pictures than from words alone, from animation and narration together than only from animation or narration or on-screen text, when corresponding words and pictures are presented close rather than far from each other on the page or screen, when corresponding words and pictures are presented simultaneously rather than one after another, when extraneous, interesting, but irrelevant material is excluded rather than included, when important information in the learning material is marked or emphasized, when an animation or text are broken down into smaller segments, when they are presented with worked examples before they try to solve a problem on their own, when they are prompted to self-explain a step in a procedure, when they study complex material in collaboration with other students, when their prior knowledge is activated prior to learning new material, when they receive amount of guidance depending on their expertise level, Now I will further explain the cognitive theory of multimedia learning with the use of this graphic. Mayer CTML contends that words and pictures presented to the learner via multimedia presentation are processed along two separate, non-conflicting channels. They enter the sensory memory through the ears and eyes. Words and images are actively selected by the learner from the sensory memory and enter the working memory, where they are organized into a verbal model and a pictorial model. Each channel can process only a few chunks of information at a given time in working memory. The two models are then integrated with prior knowledge retrieved from long-term memory. This integration occurs within the working memory, following each segmented portion of instruction offered to the learner in the multimedia presentation. This graphic, the multimedia presentation, you can use auditory, verbal channels, as well as visual pictorial channels. In this graphic, the auditorial verbal channels are represented in blue, and the visual pictorial channels are represented in green. In the multimedia presentation area, you can use words or pictures. If you use words, the sensory memory is used with ears and eyes. If pictures are used, then the memory is eyes. Once the sensory memory is established, it is processed to the working memory. If words are used, then the ears use the selected words to sounds. If pictures and/or words are used, then the eyes use the selected images to the images part of the working memory. In the working memory, sounds and images can work together. Once the sounds in the working memory have been established, then it organizes the words to a verbal model. If the images are used, then the working memory organizes the images into a pictorial model. Together, these will form long-term memory. Here, prior knowledge is integrated. Now, I will explain a little more about the 3 assumptions suggested by cognitive research that I mentioned earlier. Dual channel assumption, limited capacity assumption, and active processing assumptions. I will go into more detail about the active processing assumption in this presentation. Dual coding theory. Dual processing cognitive theory was first described by Alan Pavio in 1986. The theory suggests that verbal and visual stimuli are processed separately but simultaneously in working memory. Limited capacity working memory. It is postulated that the working memory can hold a limited number of items or chunks of information at one time, which requires us to choose where to allocate cognitive resources. Ridley's model of working memory recognizes that although the central executive could store information, it was limited in its capacity to do so. Cognitive load theory was developed by John Sweller, who proposed that there were limitations on the capacity of working memory, and that the cognitive load is cumulative in nature, which can affect the ability to learn. Mayer allows limited capacity of working memory by recommending segments of instruction and excluding extraneous information. Active processing. The CTML acknowledges that humans are actively engaged in cognitive processing in order to make sense of the stimuli presented. We do not passively receive information into our memory. The concept of active processing is reflected in the CTML by the inclusion of selecting, organizing, and integrating information. Mayer states, perhaps the most crucial step in multimedia learning involves making connections between word-based and image-based representations. Information transfer. When meaningful learning takes place, people are able to retrieve newly acquired knowledge from long-term memory when they need it to perform a given task. Transfer can be further divided into near transfer for knowledge that is used immediately after learning it, and far transfer for when knowledge is needed some time after learning it. Clark and Mayer recommended using work examples to facilitate both types of transfer. So let's go into the active processing assumptions more. Let's look more closely at what I mentioned before about what is the practical meaning of cognitive theory of multimedia learning and some of its examples. From words and pictures, then from words alone. Illustrations and diagrams can reduce irrelevant mental load. Information, especially spatial information, can be presented in a diagram more concisely than in text. For example, figures 1 and 2 show the same information presented in text and in diagram format. Although the text in figure 1 is accompanied by a graphic of an actual check, processing the information presented in the screen is still difficult. On the other hand, in Figure 2, the representation of an account number that relies more on a diagram and less on text is more easily comprehended without overloading memory. Can use simple graphics for deeper learning. When using visuals, reduce mental load by applying a consistent graphical style with less visual noise. Line drawings are less complex than photographs that have many details competing for the viewer's attention. Gradations of color or shading in photographs often make it hard to discriminate details such as switches, slots, and outlets in equipment. Line art emphasizes the key aspects by eliminating the visual noise. For this reason, technical publications often use line art so that the learner can clearly discriminate among all parts. Several experiments found better comprehension learning from a simpler visual than from a more complex format. Here is a comparison to help us better understand, for instance, a heart circulation presented in 3 formats: text, text plus simple line drawing, or text plus the more accurate 3D drawing. In this figure is to compare the simple and complex graphic version. Both visual formats led to more learning than text alone. However, the simpler line drawings was more effective than the 3D version, especially for low knowledge learners. Explain complex graphics with words and audio. It is better to explain a visual with words in a text format or with audio narration. There is strong evidence that a mental load is affected not only by features of the illustration but also the modality of the words. Many experiments show that when presenting complex visual information such as detailed static illustrations or dynamic visuals, learning is maximized when the illustrations were explained by words presented with audio rather than with text. In 17 different experiments involving lessons that explained how lightning or brakes work, as well as online botany game, Mayer found better learning when visuals were explained by audio narration than when they were explained by text. Use words or graphics alone when information is self-explanatory. Although it is usually best to describe complex visuals with words and audio rather than in text, sometimes it's better to leave out the words altogether and simply rely on the visuals to carry the instructional message. And in other situations, it might be better to simply use text and not add an illustration at all. In some situations, words alone are sufficient for learning. Adding a redundant illustration does not improve outcomes. Adding words to the simple graphic representation, as we see here, would likely slow down the learning process. Use previews and overlays with complex visuals. Mayer, Mathis, and Wetzel produced preview lesson segments both in paper and in multimedia formats. The previews used graphics and text to explain how individual components involved in a complex mechanical process worked. This figure shows a print version of the lesson preview. The training consisted of a short narrated animated multimedia lesson on how hydraulic brakes work. After reviewing the lesson, participants answered test questions such as, suppose you press on the brake pedal in your car, but the brakes don't work. What would have gone wrong? Learning was compared between groups that received the previews before the training and groups that received the training without previews. Previews, whether provided on paper or in multimedia, resulted in significantly better learning. The authors recommended before presenting a multimedia explanation, make sure learners visually recognize each major component, can name each component, and can describe the major state changes of each component. In short, make sure learners build component models before presenting a cause and effect explanation of how a system works. Hello, and welcome to the Trinidad State Junior College video series on Desire to Learn. This is a video on how to use the Grade Setup Wizard in D2L. Here I am on the course home environment in the course home page. I will begin by clicking on Grades in the nav bar. On the Grades page, there is a Grades area box. There are 4 options: Enter Grades, Manage Grades, Schemes, and the Setup Wizard. We will go to the Setup Wizard. On the Wizard page, a summary is displayed. I will click Start. In step 1 of 7 in the Wizard setup, we will use the point system. Most choose this because it's easy for instructors and students to follow. Weighted is where percentages are prescribed to the grade items, and formula is where you have a customized grading system.